Before I begin, I would like to thank Annie for turning my scribblings into an all-singing, all-dancing PowerPoint. And I would like to thank Karen for turning my ramblings into a British Sign Language. Thank you. Now, you may wonder why I, a person brought up hearing in England, have the nerve to talk to you about deaf people in Ireland. Well, I'll explain, but first of all, I want to say that I'm well aware there are people in this room who know a great deal more about it than I do. We have this room until 3 o'clock, so anybody that wants to stay after, have a cup of coffee and sock it to me, you're very welcome. Right. Okay. How did I turn up here? I was in England, coming to the end of my training as a psychiatrist. I knew my hearing was going down and I gave up anaesthetics for that very reason. They got a bit tricky with the machines, but it was great. I no longer had to listen to surgeons' political opinions in theatre. However, I thought it might be a little safer if I went into general practice, and I was doing my psychiatry 6 months when I realised that the job description of a psychiatrist is galloping around, sticking your nose into other people's business. And as such, it suited me perfectly. I was coming to the end of my training in psychiatry when there was a new professor of psychiatry in Birmingham, Ian Brockington, and he was approached by Robin Cayley, who was the head of Birmingham Deaf Centre, to say that if deaf people in Birmingham had mental health problems, they had to go to services in either Preston or London. So he asked me if I would be prepared to start a service. I was asked because I wore hearing aids. I did not accept for that reason. I accepted because I went to the Deaf Centre and they thought, oh God, we've got stuck with her. She's got plastic in her ears. She knows nothing, which I didn't. But I started to learn to sign. And one afternoon, my lovely deaf sign language teacher, Carl, the little Russian Carl, he took me into the old people's bingo afternoon. Now, all these old people were obviously considerably younger than I am now. And he indicated to the bingo caller, we've got a hearing visitor. And he left me there. And two nice ladies beckoned to me and said, come here, dear. Sit down, we'll look after you. I've been returning that favour for more than 30 years. I started in a cupboard in the basement of a hospital that was about to be demolished. Ended up with 40 staff, 12 beds and a catchment area of the Third of England. I became a trustee of the RNID and I was at a meeting when, guess what, I met Brian Symington. Now those in this room know Brian Symington. He was the director of Northern Ireland RNID, and Brian has a way of letting other people have his way. I was over here visiting, and he said, we need a mental health service for deaf people over here. They were getting a 2-monthly outreach clinic from good people in Manchester. I said, okay, Brian, give me a file and a back of an envelope. I did some sums, and I said, well, if nobody, you need a psychiatrist 2 days a week. If nobody else will do it, I will do it. Now at this point, a decent length of industrial strength duct tape across my big mouth would have saved a lot of trouble. But as it wasn't available, I said, okay, I'll do it. And I did. So I came over here and then I commuted for a couple of years, and then I moved here, and then I spent the other half of the week in the Republic. They eventually threw me out about 4 years ago. During this time, my remaining hearing disappeared, which I hadn't necessarily expected to happen. I had this bridge magnet hammered into my head just in time. So now, without this bridge magnet on my head, cochlear implant, I can't hear a plane land. With it on, I can pass as a sort of hearing person, you know. Anyway, so that's me. That's how I'm here. And I want to download to you in less than an hour what it's taken me more than 30 years to learn. I'm going to start at the beginning, go to the middle, and then end up somewhere. I'm sure you'll bear with me. Now, what? Let me see if I can do this. I have, yes. What? Now, I have some facts. The thing is about deafness, it's, okay, it's a medical blah blah, but it isn't. It's a way of living, it's a way of being. And okay, there's some medical stuff about, whatever, but that's not the important thing at all. Now, analogies with sight problems are different, but let me just start with one. There are zillions of people who wear these reading glasses, okay? And even people who lose most or indeed all of their sight in later life, their situation is totally different to somebody who's born completely blind. Now, I think that's pretty obvious. If you use the same thing for deaf people, as you can see here, at least 1 in 6 people have some hearing loss of one sort. In young people, it's mainly middle ear problems. In older people, there's extra bits. There's age-related changes to the cochlea. So, as a deaf person myself, who's been everything from totally hearing to completely deaf, this is something that I have experienced personally. And the facts about people with partial acquired deafness, it takes people 10 years before they do anything about it. They get a hearing aid and they don't want to wear them because they hurt and whistle at you and a bloody nuisance. And interestingly, is over the last, 20 years, so nobody ever seems to flag it up, is that if you have acquired hearing loss to a significant degree, it increases your chances of presenting earlier with dementia. It doesn't cause dementia, but it causes it to present itself earlier. Now, this is for 2 main reasons. One is it increases social isolation, which is a risk factor in itself. And secondly, I don't know how to put this, they say you use up more of your cognitive reserve in managing. It means people like me spend a large amount of their remaining marbles trying to figure out what the hell is going on. So, as well as eating your 5 a day and going for a run and all that, get your hearing tested. And hearing aid manufacturers are clued into this. Protect your brain, get a hearing aid, 2,000 quid, So that is something that always gets left out. But that's all I'm going to say about people who lose their hearing. The rest of what I've got to say is about, is that not going? Why is that not going? Oh, Annie, can you it's gone. Now, I hope you meant by this that was somebody taking their hearing aid off, because we are talking about people that hearing aids don't reach. So 1 in 1,000, nice easy for the sums. 1 in 1,000 people are profoundly or pretty profoundly deaf from birth or early life. Now, I mentioned the causes, firstly, because I can't help myself, I'm a bloody medic. And half are genetic, more than 80 genes, most of them recessive, most of them causing deafness only. There were few that cause other problems like Usher's, where you're born deaf and then you gradually lose your sight through retinitis pigmentosa. So, yes. But mostly people, they're just deaf, that's it. The non-genetic causes, obviously, things like rubella, birth hypoxia, etc., they are things that can cause difficulties, whether they cause deafness or not. However, it's not all or nothing. I've got friends who are deaf from rubella, have got PhDs. It's all very variable. But what it means is that over 95% of people who are profoundly deaf from early life are born into hearing families. The people who are born deaf in deaf families, either because of, say, a culture where your first cousin marriages more often, or a dominant gene, these people are the heart of the deaf community. Deaf families, first language sign, kids grow up signing, just they grow up, speaking French or Welsh or whatever. I very rarely see, as a psychiatrist, people who are deaf in deaf families. They're not immune from all the usual stuff, but you don't have extra stuff from people's predicaments if they're born into hearing families. I'll tell you more about that later. Right. The next thing to say, having said that most people who have early profound deafness are perfectly ordinary human beings. They can do everything except hear, you know. And I mean, I can go from deaf to hearing just with a flick of my fridge magnet. So all this stuff about what deaf people are like, blah, blah, just forget it. Now, the next thing, sign languages. Sign languages are full languages, okay? And they are processed in the same part of the brain as hearing languages. If your reading is not processed in the visual cortex of your brain, if you're reading Braille, it's not in the sensory cortex, it's in the part of the brain that processes language. So whether you communicate by using your hands or making a noise is immaterial, it's language. National languages, sign languages, have sprung up around the world wherever there is enough of a deaf community. And a very interesting example was in Nicaragua, mid last century. The government there decided to open a deaf school. Deaf children from all over the country who have been isolated in hearing families, but have put together a kind of home sign with their families, were put together and immediately they developed a sort of home sign language of their own. But it didn't turn into a full grammatical language until younger deaf children came in, and their developing brains picked up this, and their brains turned it into a full sign. It's the same when hearing languages, when spoken languages moved, because in the brain there's a critical period for language development. This is called the language acquisition device by Chomsky, no less. And I have to confess that when I was hearing, I heard a lecture by Chomsky, and I still only understood the occasional end. But if you miss the boat, if you haven't got a first language by the time you're 7 or 8, your brain can't produce it anymore. It can manage, but it will not develop a full grammatical language. I think of it like an iceberg. And the bit underneath is what we call mental ease. And you need a language to build the mental ease. And once you've done it, you can learn other languages. But if you don't build the mental ease to start with, then you're, well, I won't say the word. I mean, I don't have current or macaroons high. So, the other thing I often get asked, fair enough, is sign language international? Now, my answer is, can you think of any reason why a deaf community in Peru would have the same language as a deaf community in Nepal? And they think, oh. And I say, well, look, hearing people haven't managed a single language. How do you expect deaf people to do it? Having said that, languages have moved around the world for the same reason that spoken languages have. And there is something called international sign, which is the equivalent of Esperanto. It was developed by the World Federation of the Deaf, and it's used in meetings and stuff like that. Right, so having established that deaf people, present company accepted, are normal, and that sign languages are full languages, we know both of those things as facts. Let's see what in history has been made of all this. Well, it's not a good story. I'm reminded of something that Martin Luther King said. He said, never underestimate the power of sincere ignorance and conscientious stupidity. Right, that's it. Has it gone? Ah, yes. So just to, the whole business about whether deaf people are disabled, yeah. I don't consider myself disabled, except when I went to, park near the outlet in Tesco's, I say my hearing aid is really very heavy. And also to get some of the things that they're entitled to, like interpreting and practical assistance. Many deaf people have to go down the disabled route. But No, it's society that makes. Oh, hang on, I need to go back a bit. Oh yes, here we are. Let's look at how all these brainy people, I mean, they were hearing, but they were brainy, funny enough. Some of the things that they've said, I don't know if you can read that. I've got old Aristotle with a giant brain. Those who are born deaf become senseless and devoid of reason. St. Augustine, innocence is sometimes born deaf, which blemish indeed hinders faith, as witness the apostle who said faith comes by hearing. So, yes, great, hey? We'll move up to Anglo-Saxon times. And of course, you know, if you go back to the ancient world again, I mean, in Sparta, if you had a deaf baby, you gave it fox therapy. You left it on the hillside on a fox ate it, so it wasn't a problem. In Anglo-Saxon law, if you did something really naughty, you had to pay. And because deaf people, you know, were up to it, then their relatives would have to pay. Now, if the crime the deaf person had committed meant that if hearing, he would have had his arm chopped off or, you know, being bumped off, it was a bit rough to ask for the relatives to do that. So a crime became what's known as bootless. The boot being a compensation, you couldn't do it. Deaf people could be killed for half price. It makes you wonder if a deaf person killed a deaf person. Anyway, don't actually go on that. But this is what was happening to deaf people in the big outside world. Roman law is even better. It was thought that what separated humans from animals was speech. So if you didn't speak, you weren't human. So you didn't exist in law. You couldn't inherit, you couldn't property, you couldn't collect property, you couldn't marry, you couldn't make a will. Now, this was a little tricky for some aristocratic families in 16th century Spain, because they all married each other, which means that recessive genes come to the fore, and one of them was deafness. So if you were a posh Spanish aristocrat, and your only son was deaf, well, you're in a bit of a mess if it meant that, you know. So they would try and get these deaf people to speak. Now, there were lots of efforts like this, but the most famous is Ponce de Leon, who was a Benedictine monk. Now, he never divulged his methods, but he was a Benedictine, and the orders of monks each had their own sign language, and they would use it during periods when, for religious reasons, they had to be silent. Crafty, hey, isn't it? It's like slaughtering a whale of fish so you can eat it on Fridays. There's no limit to human ingenuity. So, but he never divulged how he did it. But speech was the thing to go for. Right. Now, this is when things start getting a little hopeful. Just before the French Revolution, Abbé de la Paix in Paris, he noticed two deaf sisters. They worked at their home as tailors. He saw them in the street signing to each other, and he thought, oh, they've got to go to hell because they can't hear the word of God. And he made the intellectual leap of actually learning some sign language and teaching them the gospel in their own language. He started by making a very complicated sign grammatical French, but his successor, Abbé Sicard, realized that French sign was in fact a complete language. These schools became famous throughout France and throughout Europe. People would go to exhibitions where there would be, you know, somebody signing and answering questions and all the rest of it. So there was a bit of a freak show, if you like, but it had the positive effect of raising the profile of deaf education. And they were deaf teachers, and it was amazing. In Germany and England, there was parallel development, in that they thought, well, if these deaf people can be educated, then they've got to jolly well speak. And Braidwood had a school, among other places, in Edinburgh. And Dr. Johnson, on his trip to the Hebridean Isles, he visited the school and he saw these poor kids trying to learn to speak. And he described deafness as one of the most desperate of human calamities. Meanwhile, back in Paris, they were signing happily away. Now, it gets even more interesting in that in 1815, in Hartford, Connecticut, a surgeon, Manson Cogswell, had a deaf daughter, Alice, and a young friend of the family, Gallaudet, Thomas Gallaudet, was befriending her, and he sent Thomas Gallaudet to Europe to learn how to educate a deaf child. He went to a Braidwood school, and Braidwood said, sorry, I'm going to say it, go away. It's secret. So Gallaudet had the good sense to go on to Paris. He saw education in sign, and he took, now I don't know how you say Laurent, I don't know if it's clerk or clerk, anyway, he took Laurent back to America with him. And the school was started for deaf children in Hartford, Connecticut. And they used French Sign Language, but also Martha's Vineyard, where there was a lot of genetic deafness, had got its own sign, and everybody there signed deaf or hearing. So the American Sign Language developed from that. And American Sign later went around the world because missionaries would take it. Similarly, British schools started in Australia, so British Sign is, so, you know, but then it all develops its own way, it's like any other language. So we're getting there, at long last, deaf people are being educated in their own language. Yeah, it's too good to be true, obviously. In Ireland, things moved along nicely. In 1816, you know how benign us Brits were to the island of Ireland. Oh, you know, they started a deaf school in Claremont using British Sign Language. Now, I'm sure you can guess the rest. They were teaching them to be good little Protestants. So the priest saw these little deaf kids in a corridor walking past the Catholic church, cursing it. So he sent nuns to the school in Paris and came back so they could teach them to be little Catholics. And of course, they came in French Sign Language. So Irish Sign is developed from that. So ISL is completely different from BSL, and that's why. But in fact, when you travel the world, ISL is more useful because I can do ISL and I can understand American Sign as well. So, you know, anyway, there it was. So St Mary's and St Joseph's started using French Sign Language, but now we get to the next bit. They decided that they should teach the boys and the girls different variants. So they couldn't get together and breathe. Now, firstly, this was a nonsense because, as I said, you know, most deaf people have hearing kids. It was also immoral because the brothers and sisters would be separated. And it was also completely useless because the women learnt lament. And before you say, yeah, they were bright because they could understand the men, but they could still gossip without the men understanding them. Another thing that happened at that time was, well, I'll tell you about that in a minute. Bridge Park School opened, which was mainly oral. Then St Mary's and St Joseph's became a Holy Family, and other schools in Limerick and Cork. In Northern Ireland, deaf education started with the Congregational Church and moved to Lisburn Road and then to Jordanstown. So the perception came, rightly or wrongly, I honestly do not know, that Protestants in Northern Ireland went to Jordanstown and Catholics went to Dublin. And this was largely true for whatever reason. So there's an admixture of ISL, BSL in this country. And it's great because when I was working both sides of the border, I didn't know which one I was doing, and I would be talking to deaf people. They didn't know which one they were doing either. So it just, you know, it was great. It was great. Right, now then. the education controversy. Now, I think I said that the signing schools were a little too good to be true. And here's our old friend, good old Alexander Graham Bell. And you can see for yourself that he considered that deaf people a defective race of human beings, and at all costs they must be prevented from breeding, which meant, you know, learning sign, having deaf communities, you know, going to mixed boarding schools. I mean, you can't have that. I mean, come on. Do you know the ironies of this? Firstly, his father was the original of Professor Higgins in My Fair Lady. He was a language expert. And Graham Bell, Alexander himself, both his wife and his daughter had partial deafness. So just like not avoiding, you could make hay with that, couldn't you? Anyway, so this was his thing, but so should deaf children be forced to speak, or could they sign? I mean, the answer is, you know, give them both. Anyway, but they haven't thought of that. So this controversy raged, and it came to a head in the Congress of Milan in 1880. Now, if you ever want to organise a conference where you want to predetermine the vote, read this. There are 164 people there, only one was deaf, and about 2 thought sign language was a good idea, one of them being Thomas Gallaudet's son. The actual proceedings have such gems, as you see. Signs are not sufficient to express tolerance of thoughts. The fantastic language of sign magnifies the senses and inflames the passion, whereas speech elevates the mind. Or not, I mean, look at her passion being inflamed. Another wonderful argument was by somebody from the Brompton Hospital talking about the prevalence of TB in residential schools. And this, you'll be pleased to know, is because they weren't speaking, so they weren't breathing properly. Anyway, sign language was banned in schools for a century. All the deaf teachers lost their jobs. The whole thing just, yes. There was, by the time you get to the 1960s, there's only one school in the world, I believe in Bangkok, that allowed sign. The British Deaf Association was founded in 1890 as a direct result of this policy, and its founder members included Francis McGinn, who was a deaf teacher in Belfast. Right, here we have Professor Ewing in Manchester, and of course, in the 20s and 30s, and especially the 40s and 50s, hearing aid technology came in. So people who had been functionally deaf, which was many from middle ear disease, blah, 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 they now could function as hearing because you had hearing aids. Well, I mean, okay, fair enough. But it meant that this gave the oralists a kind of new impetus. And I've actually got this book, I'll keep it in my asbestos chamber. The educational guidance and the deaf child. So as you see, these deaf children have to achieve hearing mindedness from their parents. And so they're ready to go to school and wait for it, 2 years old. And the highest priority for deaf children is learning to talk. Yeah, okay. And then there was a Lewis Committee on deaf education, and Dr. Denmark, who his father was the head of the deaf school in Liverpool, and he signed with deaf children behind the bike sheds. His brother Frank was headmaster of Jordan's Town School here. Dr. Denmark started mental health services for deaf people in Preston in the 1960s, and he questioned Professor Ewing for this committee, saying, look, come on. And he said that he wouldn't do anything about using any sort of sign unless everything else had failed. And when you think about doing this at 12, now, of course, that's way beyond the language acquisition time. Dublin, the Republic of Ireland, escaped this until rather later. Sister Nicholas Griffey was a very good signer, and signing continued in schools in Dublin. But then she went to a conference in Manchester, listened to the viewings, and came back, and sign language was banned like that. Like that. And basically, I spent much of my career dealing with the consequences of these policies. Oliver Sacks wrote about the history of deaf people, and he said it wouldn't have mattered if oralism had worked, but unhappily it was the reverse. It was an intolerable price was paid. And Paddy Loud, who was a deaf activist who was mainstreamed, deaf people can be trapped in a vacuum of an experience with our school years behind us. Right, so things started to happen. William Stokoe published a dictionary of American Sign Language, and deaf people were astonished that, I mean, to them, sign, I mean, there you are, but it had all the features, grammar, syntax, everything that spoken languages had. And I don't know if you know, this is a play by Molière, who said there was this French man who was amazed that people have been speaking prose all their lives. And similarly, deaf people thought, that's our sign. Oh, it's the same. Everything. So that was, it seems obvious now. Though I will tell you, when the British Sign Language Dictionary first came out, do you know where it was filed in the bookshop? Under medical. I mean, I don't want to be even more offensive, but would you file African languages under dermatology? I don't think so. It is that offensive. But that's what happened. Anyway, Susan Gregory, a researcher in Birmingham, where there was a school for teachers of the deaf, which was strictly oral, she turned the situation around. She did a cohort of deaf school leavers, and they were screened for intellectual disability or any other problem. 14 out of 82 couldn't actually complete an interview in either speech or sign. She revisited them 10 years later, and most of them were signing. Similarly, Conrad looked at school leavers, and they have an average reading age of 9. Their lip reading was no better than an untutored hearing person. At the time, the Warnock report was going for mainstream education for people, kids with any extra thing, which, if it's a physical thing or whatever, I mean, fair enough. But the UNESCO Salamanca statement on special education put a proviso in that for deaf people and deaf-blind people, they should be in an environment where their communication was maximised and their awareness of sign language and their link to the deaf community should be strengthened. So the tide was starting to turn, you might say. But for a long time, the stories, I've met thousands of deaf people, colleagues, friends, patients, and for so many of them, the story was deafness wasn't realised for, they taught at school sometimes. I mean, I used to think, the Irish audiogram was grandma dropping a saucepan or granddad starting his tractor, because the poor kid wouldn't be talking and they'd think, what, Anyway, finally. And also, in England, I mean, probably here, but I came across it. Before you had these evoked retentions and, all this clever audiological screening, the health visitor would stand in front of the kid and somebody behind the child would ring a bell. And if the kid turned, we thought, but if the person was wearing glasses, the little kid could see in the reflection of the glasses what something was happening behind them. So anyway, just don't go there. So neonatal screening, it means that earlier, but of course it then reignited earlier the controversy speech sign. And in the middle of this comes cochlear implants. Now, I'd be a hypocrite if I was against them because I've got one. When deaf people, some deaf people, I can understand it, say, look, this is just oralism by surgery. And a personal friend of mine in Leicester, because in England, it depends what the policy was in each county. I mean, just you couldn't believe it. Leicester was, they got a talk county. And he was told when he had a newly diagnosed deaf child that if he let her sign, she would be refused a cochlear implant. This wasn't actually true, certainly not from the cochlear implant program, but that's the advice he was given by the teachers. At the same time, he was being approached by deaf people and saying, look, she's not going to talk sign. She ended up doing both, which is fine. My friend said to me, when he was deciding what to do, he said, well, supposing we do an implant on this child, and then she grows up, and she thinks, we couldn't accept her as she was. And I said, you'd be able to have that discussion. And then if she takes it off, or even takes it, that's fine. So, I mean, she signs, she speaks, she's, you know, whatever. But it was a very, very tricky thing. And it's, you know, but and then if you see a television program about it, they've got people in opposite corners to argue. You know, I mean, it's not an argument. It's just one of, anyway, you can imagine. So whatever you do, there's always something else, another difficulty. Right, now I don't think there's any lawyers here. I did forensic psychiatry, and I would do quite a lot of reports for deaf people, particularly with regard to fit to plead for court cases. And you would be amazed. Right, in the olden days, if you were charged with something, well, to this day, if you're charged with something, you have to enter a plea, guilty or not guilty, and then guilty, not guilty, but whatever. But especially you can't or won't. Now, if you don't speak to dental plea, that was mute by malice. If you didn't speak because you were deaf or whatever, that was mute by visitation of God. If you were mute by malice, so you wouldn't plead, the reason for that would be that if you made a plea and came to trial, then you could lose all your estates to the Crown. But if it didn't reach a trial because you wouldn't plead, then that didn't happen. So guess what they did if you were mute by malice? Well, they questioned your death, basically. I can't pronounce it very well, but pain, torture, dure. You'd be stretched out on the floor in a cell, and they would pile rocks on you until you pressed and died. And if you managed to hold out, okay, you were dead, but your relatives didn't forfeit your estate. If you then pleaded before you died, then they can carry on. Now, the last case, 1741, not bad, hey? If you were mute by visitation of God, or you plead, a guilty plea would be entered on your behalf, but after 1827, a not guilty plea would be entered on your behalf. Interesting advances in this sort of law have come from deaf test cases. Pritchard in 1836, it just said his crime was bestiality. I don't think we need to go into details, but it would be a crime at that time that would have been punishable by death. I mean, you know, we stole 5p and it was punishable by death. But anyway, so he was deaf, could not plead, and he ended up being detained in a psychiatric hospital at Her Majesty's pleasure. His Majesty would have been there. And that may seem a bit rough, but considering his crime would have had capital punishment, he probably got off fairly lightly, so it was not act of mercy. Fast forward to 1986, which was within my career. Glenn Pearson, it was the same law. He was a not very bright deaf chap who was always being picked up for petty crimes and stuff. And he stole £10 and 3 light bulbs. They were a bit fed up with him, so they took him to court. They found him mute by visitation of God, and he was detained at Her Majesty's pleasure indefinitely in a psychiatric hospital. He got out on a tribunal, of course, so he wasn't there forever, but it was obviously that the law was mass. So there was a lot of fuss about it, and eventually the fitness to plead process and laws were changed in two significant ways. Firstly, you needed at least two psychiatrists or experts to say whether they were fit or not. And if they disagreed, and I've been in a murder trial, well, I disagreed with the other opinion. What a fun way to spend a day. And a jury will hear the evidence of are they fit to plead or are they not fit to plead. Then, if they are found fit to plead, a plea is entered. If they're found unfit to plead, then at long last, you have a trial of the facts. Because in the past, people would be found unfit to plead, put away. They didn't even know whether they'd done it or not. There was a famous case of, I think, a chap with some intellectual disability who was put inside for something for ages after being found unfit to plead. And it turned out they had an alibi, never done it in the first place. So we now have a proper jury deciding on fit to plead, hearing the evidence, and then we have a trial of the facts if they in fact do it. And I mean, this is pretty recent, isn't it, for that to get to that. So, right. We all know this. At long last, all these declarations of human rights, and I will include, they were a little reluctantly the rights of people with disabilities, is actually there. And finally, these treaties are ratified to say, look, come on, you can't keep treating deaf people like this. And in fact, in Article 24, it actually says about the use of using sign language. Recognition of sign languages. There was an EU resolution, the Northern Ireland office, ISL recognised by the Irish government. I put some books and press cuttings up out there and you will see the article in the Irish papers of when this came out. It was amazing. BSL has been recognised by the UK Parliament. The MP who really pushed this forward is the Child of Deaf Parents herself. Needless to say, it hasn't been ratified here because, well, you know all that. But, yes. Exactly, we'll get there. Right, I'm going to finish by telling two stories. I have had, as well as meeting so many people and hearing their stories, I've had quite interesting experiences myself as a deaf person. Before I get on to these people, I will just tell you one story because it's so I was giving a talk which included oralist teachers of the deaf. And you could always tell them because they go bright red and start grinding their teeth. And one came up to me afterwards and said to me in that kind, patient voice that they use, she said, do you think more slowly because you are deaf? And I hesitated. I didn't know whether I should answer yes or no. So she obviously thought I was thinking slowly. So I said, didn't stop me getting a first at Cambridge and walked away. The other time, I may assure you that I'm not often rendered speechless, but there was an occasion here that I was. I was talking to teachers and of deaf children and educationalists, blah, 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 for child services ages ago. And I spoke about a chap I'd seen in Northern Ireland for a report. He had no sign and he had very poor speech. And his background was he was at school and he was diagnosed, he was in his 40s by the time I saw him, he was diagnosed with something called AVA. Now, I had actually no idea what that was. It was explained to me that it was auditory verbal agnosia, which meant he didn't take any notice of what was said to him. When he was 8, he was found to be severely deaf, and they regarded this as an incidental finding. I was at a meeting and I was talking to somebody who had been an educational manager back in the day, and I asked him about this. I said, "You are?" And he said, "Well," he said, "you couldn't get them to listen to you." And I said, "They were deaf." He said, "Well," and I said, "What about signs?" "No, that wasn't a policy." And I said, if you'd been an orthopaedic surgeon in China in the 19th century, would you have done foot binding? And he just looked at me and I just had to walk away. He still thought it was all right. Wouldn't listen to what he said. Well, yeah, anyway. So I didn't deck him. I used up years to learn self-control, but I did not deck him. I'm really pleased to know. I was at the unfit to plead if I had. Anyway, let's go back to my dear friend Patrick. Is there a picture of him? Let me see. Oh no, there isn't. What's happened? There's, oh, I'm sorry there isn't a picture of him. He's a darling. His painting is on the cover of a psychiatric journal, which is on that table over there. I've got time to tell you his story properly. Patrick was born in 1943 in a psychiatric hospital in rural Kerry. His mother had schizophrenia. He was taken from her at birth. He never got out of that hospital. It gradually got devolved into smaller things, but he never left institutional care. They knew he was deaf, but he never received, had no mental illness, perfectly normal intelligence. He never had any language at all. No speech, no sign, no reading, nothing. No language at all. When he was in his 40s, the deaf care home in, older adults care home in Dublin, the nuns from there visited him and offered to take him back to Dublin. His consultant psychiatrist refused. A social worker tried to teach him a bit of Irish sign when he was in his 50s, but of course it was far too late. I eventually saw him in 2006 when they were looking at closing his hospital and they didn't know what to do. So how do you interview somebody who's got no language? Well, I knew he liked to paint. So I asked him to have some paintings there that I could look at with him. There was me, Stephen Brown, my nurse, Margaret du Feu, Irish Sign Language interpreter. And her parents were deaf and well respected in the deaf community, so she could make contact with anybody. Margaret's only fault was she's about this tall, so I had to go for my entire career as Big Margaret. So me and Stephen and Margaret, there we are. And there's young Patrick, well, old Patrick, and it's his birthday. But there was no way you could explain it. I mean, how would you? So we took a paddock anyway. So we looked at the pictures, and you'll see from over there, they're quite highly coloured. And I was pointing at some of the colours, and Margaret was doing the signs. So red is red. So said, oh, red. You could see him get it. Red. His jumper was red. He pointed and noticed on the wall it was red. We did more colours and he got it. His painting had the sun in it, and he pointed out the sun in other paintings, and he pointed at the sun out the window. We stopped for cake, and then we did some drawings. I did a happy face, and Margaret did the sign for happy and sad. And anyway, he got it. And then he said, name, that's good. And I said, Margaret. And he copied. And pointed and said, Margaret. And something must have clicked, because he said, sign. And I said, your name? You've got a name? Come on, why would he have a name? Patrick, that's the P. So we said, you name Patrick. Patrick. In the end, we had to go, and I was just walking away, and he tapped my arm, And I turned back to him and he said, me, Patrick, I'm happy pointing with him when I paint. I tell you, I just went out and burst into tears. We went back for the next 12 years, 10 years. Every time we went down there, we'd take him out to tea and we'd laugh. And then all sorts of stupid things are said about people who don't have the language. You know, the theory of mind, can you see what somebody else is thinking? We were really cheeky. We'd take them out to tea and there would be a table and we'd have scones and then Stephen would go and get the teas and I'd hide Stephen's scone. And Patrick knew damn well where the scone was and then Stephen couldn't see it. And we would really laugh ourselves silly. We'd play that stupid game, which is like Simon says, stand up, sit down, and you're meant to do the opposite. And he could do it and laugh with us when we did. He gave me paintings, he could do jigsaw puzzles. We got a care worker to take him out on a boat and he'd draw it all. So he was in there, but he had no language at all. And you know what scares the pants off me? If I'd been born as deaf as I am now in 1950, that could have happened to me. You know? People saw. People like Patrick have been written about for a very long time. Have you read The Heart is a Lonely Hunter, Carson McCullers? Written in the 1930s, and there's a deaf man and his deaf friend is put on a blackboard and goes to visit him. And the deaf man picks up his hands and says, it's been so long, my hands have forgotten. I've seen people like this true. This country. Right, that's darling Patrick. So I got his permission to put his painting on a cover. I've got a picture of him holding it and he died of cancer after, bless him. But, you know, I'll never forget him. Now, the next chap, my last chap, is, oh, that's come up beautifully, I didn't know it had, great. As you see, he's in the public domain, and you'll see here, perhaps, I was in court for his sentencing. He's somebody who probably died on the streets and may yet, well, of right, of course. Let me tell you Edward's story. He's the same age as my daughter. Born in Dublin, only deaf one of his family, not the most functional family, not the most reckless sandwich in a lunchbox, but a nice young man. Failed completely at any sort of education, sign not that brilliant, family, you know, using drugs, etc. Anyway, so no support, leave school, no support. Ended up on the streets and drugs and all the usual stuff. I remember seeing a headline in the paper saying, deaf man kills drug addict or something. He got into a scuffle with a fellow drug addict in the street and pushed him and he'd fallen under a bus and been killed. So manslaughter, okay. It received a lot of publicity because the chap he killed had come from quite a good Dublin family. I expected him to come my way for an opinion, but he didn't. And I eventually, after he had been fitness to plea, wasn't even considered. He was found guilty of manslaughter, and I was asked to see him in prison for sentencing advice. I went to see him with Margaret, of course. He didn't know where he was. He only knew the date of his offence because he'd seen the date up in the police station, it had been his birthday. He was frightened, and I said, look, do you understand your situation? You know, that somebody died. And he was furious. He said, you're trying to get me into trouble. I said, oh. He said, well, what do you want? And I said, look, I need to find out if you understand why you're here, that you accept that you pushed somebody and they died, that you didn't mean to do it, and you're sorry. Well, an hour trying to get that out, I managed it in the end. He'd been homeless. Somebody had given some evidence on his behalf, and it was somebody at the homeless shelter. He'd known her for years. He didn't know her name. She was the girl with long hair that gave him food. He didn't know how many brothers and sisters he'd got. He should not have been found fit to live, basically, but he was past that point. He was accepted by a mental health forensic facility, deaf forensic facility in England, but they couldn't agree either the legal or financial things, so he was sentenced to Mountjoy. During the sentencing court case, he was standing in the dock, signing all the time. They're lying, they're cruel, they're horrible, and the interpreter didn't interpret it. So, and the whole thing was just a farce. I would visit him in prison. He was in solitary most of the time because he was frightened. Volunteers from deaf agencies went to visit, and a counsellor in the prison saw it with an interpreter. The deaf chaplain went to see him. Edward told me that he was frightened of coming out of prison because he had nowhere to go, and he knew that if he was on the streets, They started to give him day release to the deaf centre in Dublin, and he went there and he loved it. He looked after the old ladies, he could, it was fantastic. But of course, there were other offenders who got their friends on the outside to give him drugs to smuggle in. And of course, he got caught. So everybody beat him up, people outside, people inside, and then he had to send himself to stay there. There was, in 2016, there was a report by the Health Service Executive which identified well over 200 deaf people with extra needs in the Republic of Ireland who needed supported or residential accommodation. Needless to say, nothing happened. Edward needed this, nothing happened. He finished his sentence, he went back on the streets, was found unconscious in the doorway, was taken to hospital, and had heart surgery, intensive care, which cost infinitely more than a shelter placement would have done. They discharged him again and he died on the street shortly afterwards. So, two people of different ages who've never had a chance. On a more optimistic note, is there an optimistic note? In this country, there's the sign language framework. There are people taking an interest in social justice, there's the British Sign Language recognition, and so on. So perhaps, at long last, deaf people can put their cool legacy behind them. Thank you. We don't have to vacate this room, and some tea and coffee will be coming. So if anybody wants to stay, that's fantastic. Thank you, Carol. Yeah.